run away.
And I hear this, and he says, you have breast cancer. And wait, how could that be? I'm a male, I got breast cancer?
In 1971, Hollywood was shaken by one name, Richard Roundtree, the first black hero brave enough to challenge white Hollywood. He was Shaft, the symbol of power, freedom, and absolute masculinity. But behind that brilliance was a secret never told before. A truth he kept hidden for 30 years to protect the image of Hollywood's cool, masculine man. What was Richard Roundtree hiding? Could it be the darkest chapter of his life? Let's find out in this video. New Rochelle, New York, in the 1940s. It was where working-class black families lived close together in modest neighborhoods, separated from the wealthy area by an invisible line. Richard Arnold Roundtree was born on July 9, 1942. His father, John Roundtree, was a quiet but stern man. By day, he drove a garbage truck for the city, and by night, he worked extra shifts at weddings or restaurants. Not once did he let his children go hungry. His mother, Catherine, was the opposite gentle, yet strong, working as a midwife and a housekeeper for white families. Young Richard grew up in a small house filled with the sound of jazz on the radio blending with the rumble of garbage trucks each morning. He was a curious boy who stared at the television where white heroes dominated every frame. There wasn't a single face that looked like his. At New Rochelle High School, Richard stood out not just for his tall, athletic build, but for his undeniable confidence that drew attention even before he spoke. He joined the football team and quickly became a star on the field. Sports earned him a scholarship to Southern Illinois University, opening a door out of the poor neighborhood. Yet it couldn't silence another dream quietly burning inside him, the desire to stand in front of the camera. In 1963, while everyone thought he was destined to become a professional athlete, Richard suddenly dropped out of college. No one understood, no one believed, and no one supported him. His father was furious, his mother cried, and he said only one thing: "I can't spend my life chasing a ball. I want the world to remember this face." From that moment, Roundtree began a wandering life in New York. He worked as a janitor, a salesman, even washed dishes in an Italian restaurant just to afford a room to stay. Then luck found him during a test photo shoot. A photographer from Ebony magazine, a prestigious fashion publication for Black Americans, saw him and said, "You've got the face of a man who's going to redefine strength." From an unknown model, Roundtree slowly stepped into the fashion world. The flash of cameras, endless photo shoots, and hollow compliments only deepened his hunger for something more acting. In 1967, he joined the Negro Ensemble Company, a theater group for black artists, a place where those rejected by Hollywood could find their voices again. On a small stage under dim yellow lights in front of just a few audience members, Roundtree finally lived fully inside a character for the first time. And from that moment, a future action star was born. When Hollywood finally called Richard Roundtree became the first symbol of black power. By the late 1960s, America was on fire. The Vietnam War raged on, the civil rights movement surged through the streets. Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Malcolm X was gone. Harlem burned in riots. Black Americans were angry and desperate, while Hollywood was still filled with white heroes. They wanted to see themselves real people, strong, unbroken by prejudice. In that climate, a legendary photographer turned director named Gordon Parks decided to do something bold. He wanted to put a black man on screen, not as a criminal, not as a victim, but as a hero. The film would be called Shaft. Hundreds of actors lined up for auditions. But Richard Roundtree, coming from the small stage of the Negro Ensemble Company, carried something Hollywood had never seen before: a commanding presence. When he walked into the audition room, wearing a black turtleneck and a dark leather jacket, with calm yet piercing eyes, Parks looked at him for a few seconds, turned to his assistant, and said, "That's Shaft." From an unknown stage actor, Richard Roundtree landed the lead role in a $500,000 action film modest in budget, but an unthinkable opportunity for a black man in 1971. On July 2, 1971, when Shaft premiered, millions of black Americans across the country lined up outside theaters. The crowd erupted. For the first time in history, they saw a black hero who was cool, fearless, and never bowed to anyone. The film, made for just $500,000, grossed more than $13 million, a box office explosion that MGM could hardly believe. Shaft didn't just save the studio from bankruptcy, It created the blaxploitation era, where black audiences finally saw themselves as heroes. Isaac Hayes' soundtrack soared to #1 on Billboard and won the 1972 Academy Award for Best Original Song, the first time a black artist had ever won in that category. And at the center of that revolution stood Richard Roundtree. From a struggling stage actor, he became an international star overnight. Ebony magazine called him the sexiest black man in America. Studios lined up to cast him in Shaft's big score, 1972, Shaft in Africa, 1973, and numerous television projects. Columbia Pictures even signed him for a global promotional tour featuring posters that read, "Shaft is not just a man, he's a movement." He toured across Europe, appeared on The Tonight Show. Starring Johnny Carson, dined with Muhammad Ali, and posed for photos with James Brown. To the black community, Richard Roundtree wasn't just an actor, he was the embodiment of freedom. In the 1970s, when America was still torn apart by race, Richard Roundtree made white audiences look at the screen and admit, this is a star. At the very height of his fame, the abyss was already waiting ahead. Behind the glory, Hollywood turned its back on Richard Roundtree. By the late 1970s, Hollywood had changed. The blaxploitation wave, the very genre of black action films that Shaft had created, began to lose its appeal. White critics claimed those movies were violent, crude, and distorted the image of black people. Within the black community itself, opinions were divided. Some saw those films as symbols of liberation. Others believed Hollywood was simply exploiting black culture for profit. Movies like Superfly Coffee and Foxy Brown were filled with drugs and gunfire. Studios rushed to produce them, then quickly abandoned the trend once the money stopped flowing. And like every movement that gets commercialized once it lost its value, it was erased without mercy. In 1975, MGM officially canceled Shaft 4. Richard Roundtree sat alone in a small office in Los Angeles, staring at a fax only 3 lines long. Production terminated. Market not viable. Thank you for your service. 3 lines ended an entire era. A decade of brilliance, a legend that had just been born, erased as if it had never existed. Roundtree later recalled that he stayed silent for a long time. He understood his time had passed. Hollywood now had new faces, new stars, and no place for the black hero who had fulfilled his historic mission. The Hollywood of 1975 was nothing like the Hollywood of 1971. Studios across the board shifted directions. Columbia, Paramount, and MGM, once competing to make black films, redirected all their funding to white-led productions, war films, gangster dramas, and thrillers. Left behind were hundreds of unemployed black actors. Among them stood Richard Roundtree, the trailblazer who had opened the door, now discarded by the very system he helped build. Audiences had changed too. By 1976 and 1977, America was obsessed with Rocky and its white underdog hero rising from the streets, or with Dirty Harry Clint Eastwood's tough lawman. They became Hollywood's new ideals of the American hero, strong, white, and celebrated. Meanwhile, Shaft, the first black hero, was pushed aside, dismissed as a relic of a bygone social movement. Nothing is crueler than time, and no one understands that better than Hollywood. For years, Richard Roundtree took on small roles: security guards, background cops, fathers of lead characters. Enough to pay the bills, but not enough to make audiences remember his name. In Earthquake 1974, he appeared for only a few minutes. In Man Friday 1975, his thoughtful performance was buried under weak promotion. Then came Game for Vultures. 1979, a commercial failure that sent him spiraling into depression. The calls from studios grew fewer. No more red carpets, no more camera flashes. Yet Richard Roundtree refused to drown in bitterness. No alcohol, no drugs, no scandals. He chose silence, then slowly began to rise again. By the 1980s, he started reclaiming his place, his role as Kunta Kinte Sr. in Roots. The Next Generation's 1979 brought him praise once more. Audiences saw again the same powerful eyes that had once captivated them. He went on to appear in Q the Winged Serpent 1982, City Heat 1984 alongside Clint Eastwood, and dozens of television series, including Magnum P.I. Murder, She Wrote and The Love Boat. Though he was no longer a box office star, he became a familiar face on American television, a quiet, steadfast figure who never gave up. Through resilience and perseverance, Roundtree survived the darkest phase of his career. But he had no idea that the real tragedy was still ahead. Because just a few years later, in the early 1990s, when everything seemed to have finally settled, a silent illness appeared, one that would bring the strongest man in Hollywood to his knees. The secret that broke. Richard Roundtree and the One. He hid for 30 years. It was the fall of 1993. Richard Roundtree was 51 years old, still strong, still handsome, still carrying himself with the same confident stride that once made America look up in admiration. He was in Costa Rica filming a television series. One morning, while taking a shower, he noticed a small lump about the size of a lima bean just beneath his left chest. At first, he ignored it. Probably just a muscle, he thought. But weeks passed, and the lump didn't go away. In fact, it seemed to grow larger. A faint unease began to settle in his heart. When he returned to Los Angeles, he decided to get it checked. A few days later, the phone rang. The doctor's voice trembled slightly. "Richard, I need you to come in. There's something I have to tell you in person." In that office, the man once known as Shaft sat silently as he heard two words he would never forget: breast cancer. He laughed. "Doctor, you must be mistaken. I'm a man." But the doctor only nodded quietly. The silence in the room grew so heavy it felt like the air had vanished. A man who had once embodied masculinity and power was now being told he had a disease the world associated with women. No one tells a man like him what to do in a moment like that. Roundtree left the clinic and drove for hours around Los Angeles, not remembering where he was going. He told no one, not friends, not family, not colleagues. For him, the disease was more than a threat to his life. It was a threat to his image as Hollywood's unbreakable man. He later told People magazine in 2023, "The man once called the coolest guy in the world having breast cancer." That just doesn't sound right, does it? A few weeks later, he went into surgery. The procedure, a full mastectomy on his left side, lasted nearly 3 hours. Then came 6 months of chemotherapy, a true living hell. His body shrank, his skin turned gray, his hair began to fall out. He lost nearly 18 pounds. But worse than the pain was the feeling he had each morning when he looked in the mirror and saw the long scar across his chest, the mark of something he couldn't talk about. He kept working, he kept acting. He still showed up on set with the same deep voice, calm posture, and signature smile. But before every shirtless scene, he always found an excuse to keep his clothes on. On Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, when the director asked him to film a scene without a shirt, he smiled and said, "It's cold this morning. I'd like to stay warm." No one knew that he was hiding a surgical scar. To audiences, Richard Roundtree was still Shaft cool, stoic, untouchable. But when the lights went out, he was just a man trying to survive through fear, exhaustion, and loneliness. He once said, "Every time I signed a contract, they made me take a physical. I had to lie and say I hadn't had any recent surgery. If they knew I'd had cancer, they wouldn't have hired me." 5 years later, around 1998, at a charity golf tournament in South Carolina, Roundtree was invited as a guest of honor. The event was organized to raise funds for the Mobile Mammography Unit, a traveling breast cancer screening program for rural areas. He was only expected to show up and wave. Surrounded by hundreds of people laughing and chatting, he stood silently for a moment before the microphone. Then, in a slow, steady voice, he said, "Being a breast cancer survivor has opened my eyes to a whole new world." The room fell completely silent. No one could believe what they had just heard. A few people whispered, "Did he really say that?" Then one woman began to clap. Another joined. Within minutes, the room filled with applause and tears. That was the first time Richard Roundtree revealed the secret he had hidden for over 30 years. He later recalled in Cure Today, "I was at a golf tournament in South Carolina, and I just came out and said it. There was no plan, no speech, no script. Just a moment when the weight on his shoulders demanded to be lifted. It was like a huge weight lifted off me." From that day on, the man who had once hidden his illness out of shame became a pioneer for thousands of other men. Health organizations invited him to speak. He became the first male spokesperson for the breast cancer awareness campaign of the Susan G. Komen Foundation. He spoke at conferences, visited hospitals, and encouraged men to check their bodies regularly. He told Coping magazine in 2005, "At first, I was embarrassed. I didn't want anyone to know, but I realized staying quiet could cost someone else their life." From then on, Roundtree traveled across the United States to talk shows, hospitals, and schools, speaking about a disease most men thought could never affect them. He also partnered with doctors in the Komen's Men for the Cure program and became the face of the campaign Men Can Get Breast Cancer Too. In the following years, he received hundreds of letters from both men and women. One woman wrote, "Because of you, my husband went to get checked and they found it early. You saved his life." A flight attendant once ran up to hug him in an airport saying, "Thank you. If it weren't for your talk, my husband would have never believed he could get breast cancer." The disease never returned, at least not for the next 3 decades. He said, "Every time I look at my scar, I don't see shame anymore. I see survival." Roundtree continued appearing in Sci-7 and being Mary Jane heroes, and even the 2000 remake of Shaft alongside Samuel L. Jackson. This time, he played the father of the very character that made him famous. In his 70s, he was still stylish, still smiling, but his eyes were different, deeper, calmer, as if he had finally made peace with himself. Before he became the quiet, composed man the world saw in his later years. Few people knew that Richard Roundtree had once lived a life of luxury that few could ever imagine. Parties, whiskey, and a life of luxury. Los Angeles summer of 1972. Hollywood was burning in the fever of freedom, funk, and disco. It was the age of purple velvet suits, strong liquor, and parties that stretched until sunrise. After Shaft, Richard Roundtree became the first black actor in Hollywood to earn a 6-figure salary. Ebony and Jet magazines called him Black Hollywood's Golden Man, the first of a new generation of black stars living like a true movie idol. Ebony described him as the man every woman wanted to dance with and every man wanted to be. He bought a nearly 4,000 square foot home in Sherman Oaks, complete with a pool, a mini golf course, and a garage large enough for 3 cars. His gleaming black Jaguar XJ12 became his signature, the real-life Shaft. Inside his wardrobe were tailored purple velvet suits, Italian leather jackets, and crocodile shoes, custom-made in New York. A decade later, he also owned a smaller estate in Grass Valley, California, worth about $470,000, where he would later spend his quieter years. According to estimates from Celebrity Net Worth, Roundtree's net worth in 2023 was around $2 million, modest compared to modern superstars, yet a fortune for a man who had risen from nothing. He embodied the idea of black luxury, the new wealth and pride of a people emerging from the shadows. Roundtree was invited everywhere: Beverly Hills parties, Isaac Hayes' private concerts, NAACP Image Awards nights, where he entered under blinding flashes of light. He wore Italian leather jackets with white silk scarves, crocodile shoes. From New York, smoked Havana cigars and sipped Remy Martin cognac. He was a regular at Studio 54 in New York, the very symbol of the disco era. At that time, Hollywood saw Roundtree as the face of freedom. And he lived exactly like that generous, confident adventurous. He didn't fall into addiction or scandal, but he lived fast, spent freely, and never imagined a day would come when the pace would slow. His close friend Glynn Turman once said, "Richard loved to party, loved to laugh, but he never let alcohol or women ruin him. He had style, not recklessness. But sometimes that kind of style was expensive. It was an era when everything glowed: the laughter, the money. The camera flashes, yet cracks had already begun to show. The parties piled up one after another, until one day he realized he couldn't remember the last time he had gone home just to rest. I lived fast, worked fast, and spent fast," he recalled. "But I wasn't happy. I just felt empty." And though his career was soaring, his private life was quietly falling apart. Behind the spotlight, marriage, family, and what Hollywood never saw. Richard Roundtree's first marriage was to Mary Jane Grant, a quiet but strong-willed woman who worked in the service industry. They married in 1963 when he was still modeling and far from fame. The marriage lasted less than 10 years, ending in the early 1970s, just as Shaft made him a household name. They had 2 daughters, Kelly and Nicole Roundtree. During the years when Shaft dominated pop culture, Richard Roundtree became a symbol of desire. Ebony dubbed him the Black James Bond, the most charismatic black spy on the planet. Wherever he went, women surrounded him. But that very fame suffocated his private life. Endless film shoots, long nights of parties, and constant attention slowly tore his first marriage apart in silence. He never spoke much about the reasons for the breakup, only admitting, "I wasn't a good husband. I let my work consume everything." In 1980, he married again, this time to Karen M. Ciernia, a designer and stylist in the advertising industry. They had 3 children, Taylor Morgan and John James Roundtree. For many years, this was the period when Richard tried to slow down, spend more time with his kids, and avoid the spotlight. He once said, "I want my children to know I'm not just Shaft, I'm their father." But even this marriage couldn't escape the rule of Hollywood: the brighter the light, the greater the distance. As Richard traveled constantly between Los Angeles, New York, and Atlanta for film and television projects, Karen stayed home to raise the children alone. The tension built up love turned into fatigue. They divorced in 1998 after nearly 2 decades together. "I loved her, and I love my kids," he told People. But sometimes love isn't enough. "I sacrificed too much for work." After his second marriage ended, Roundtree never remarried. He spent most of his remaining years with his family and children, living quietly in a modest home in Los Angeles. When asked what he regretted most in life, Roundtree paused for a long moment and said, "It wasn't fame. It wasn't the roles I missed. It was the dinners I wasn't there for." Still, he remained close to his children. When he was diagnosed with breast cancer, his daughters were the first to know. His eldest, Kelly, recalled in a 2023 interview, "Dad said, 'I'm fine. Don't worry. I'm Shaft, remember.' But I knew he was scared. We had never seen him that vulnerable." After recovering, Roundtree devoted more time to family, especially his sons. He often took them fishing near Malibu, taught them how to drive, how to tie a tie, and how to read people. The illness, the death, and the farewell to the last hero. October 2023. Richard Roundtree, the man who once made the world look up in awe, was quietly approaching the end of his 81-year journey. Illness, the final battle. 30 years earlier, he had defeated breast cancer, the battle he once called the greatest challenge of his life. But fate had one more test for him. In early 2023, Roundtree began feeling tired and lost his appetite. He thought it was just age catching up to him. But as the abdominal pain and weight loss persisted, he went to see a doctor. The diagnosis left his entire family in silence. Late-stage pancreatic cancer. One of his children told People Dad just smiled and said, "I've beaten death once before. If it comes again, I'll welcome it like an old friend." Doctors suggested chemotherapy could extend his time, but Roundtree refused. He chose to spend his final months without hospitals, without tubes, only peace, surrounded by nature and the people he loved. His final days. In his final weeks, Roundtree lived quietly with his children in his home in Grass Valley, the same house he had bought in the early 2000s, with a small pond, a fireplace, and a framed Shaft poster on the wall. Each morning, he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee reading, or simply staring into the distance for hours. His family said he wasn't afraid of dying. He said he had already made peace with it long ago. A day before he passed, he told his daughter Morgan his final words, "Don't cry for me. I've lived a full life." Richard Roundtree passed away on October 24, 2023. According to his representative Alan Abrams and the family's confirmation with Variety, Richard Roundtree passed away peacefully at his home in Los Angeles after a brief battle with pancreatic cancer. He was surrounded by family. That evening, the news spread, and Hollywood fell silent. Samuel L. Jackson, who starred with him in the 2000 remake of Shaft, tweeted, "Richard Roundtree opened the door for all of us. His impact on cinema changed everything. Shaft forever." Taraji P. Henson, his co-star in Being Mary Jane, wrote, "He taught me grace, professionalism, and quiet power. The coolest man ever. Rest well, Mr. Roundtree." Actor Lawrence Tate posted the blueprint, the original. "You can't spell cool without Richard Roundtree." And on that day, people repeated the words once said by Shaft's original producer, Gordon Parks Jr., If there was no Richard Roundtree, there would be no Shaft, no Denzel, no Samuel, no me. The funeral and farewell. The Roundtree family held a private funeral true to his quiet nature. The service was small, only close relatives, a few dear friends, and the soft music of Isaac Hayes playing through the chapel. There were no long speeches, no flashing cameras, only silence filled with reverence. Later in Los Angeles, the NAACP hosted a public memorial. On a giant screen, they played the iconic scene from Shaft the Hero, walking down a New York street in his leather coat, wind in his face, and theme from Shaft echoing through the room. When the clip ended, the entire audience rose to their feet and applauded. No one spoke. They just stood there looking up at the screen as if the hero was still walking forward. The legacy of Shaft, a power beyond time. Some actors leave behind great performances, but others like Richard Roundtree become the very symbol of what they once portrayed. Before Shaft, Hollywood had no image of a black hero. Black characters on screen were limited to chauffeurs, waiters, or criminals. Then Richard appeared, leather jacket, cold stare gun at his side, and changed everything. He made cool look effortless. For the first time, black audiences saw themselves as heroes. Not as victims, not as people to be pitied, but as leaders. From that moment, an entire generation of black actors followed the path he opened. Without Roundtree, there would be no Denzel Washington, no Wesley Snipes, no Samuel L. Jackson. He was the one who forced Hollywood to see the true power and dignity of black identity not through suffering, but through strength. Yet Richard Roundtree's legacy wasn't only in film. It was in the way he lived when the lights went out. It was in the moment he stood up and said, "I am a breast cancer survivor." It was in the way he turned his scar into hope for others. It was in how he proved that true strength doesn't come from muscles, but from the courage to face your own fear. "I thought silence was strength," he once said. "Now I know strength is speaking up." Those words became a message that spread across America, especially among black men for whom illness and vulnerability had long been taboo. He wasn't just Shaft. He was the man who taught the world that courage means being honest. Richard Roundtree, the trailblazer, the first hero, and the man who dared to be vulnerable in order to be strong.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore: stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.